Hey, thanks for stopping by and clicking on this video. I record under the artist name of audiotech Audio. I have releases on traxrecords of Chicago. And if you'd like to know more about me, you can visit this video here on my YouTube channel, or you can visit my website at www.auditechaudio.com. So today we're going to take a look at some basic synthesis techniques that help us create sounds that we want to use within our tracks. So let's dive straight in. So once again, here we are in Logic. I have two synthesizers open on the screen, one called Monarch and one called Serum. Now the reason I have two synthesizers open on the screen here is because they both create sounds, obviously, but both have very different user interfaces. So we're going to take a look at the different user interfaces and the controls, what they do, and compare the both so that you can then have an understanding of how these synthesizers work. So we'll start with Monarch. Looking at this synth here, we have our main section here where we have some tuning knobs, and then we have our portamento or glide knob here, and then some modulation knobs here as well. But we control the pitch bend and modulation wheel on the synth here. And we can control these from our controller keyboards that we use connected to our computers. Moving on to the oscillator section, we can see that we have three oscillators here, but we also have a noise oscillator here as well. And then we have our mixer section here, where we can route sounds from each oscillator into the mixer. And then we move over to here, where we have our filter and filter envelope, and then our amplifier as well. So let's take a little look at what these controls do to give you an understanding of how the synthesizer works. So I'm going to basically turn all of the oscillators off here. And then if I was to press a note on my MIDI keyboard, okay, you can see that something's happening, but you're really hearing any sound from this. So what we need to do is basically raise the volume of one of the oscillators and turn it on as well. So there we can now hear some sound that is coming from oscillator 1. If we look at the range here, this is basically controlling the pitch of the oscillator. So we can control then what we want this oscillator to do here as well. Then we have waveforms for each of the oscillators. So here we can move from a triangle, some saws, and then squares, and pulse waves. So you can see that each of these oscillators sound very different. Then if we move down here, we have the second oscillator has the same controls. Here we have a bit of more of a fine tune on this oscillator here. So I'm going to turn this one off, turn on oscillator 2, and turn up its volume. So let's play this one. So you can see that this knob here is giving us a finer control over the pitch of this oscillator. And we have the same thing here for oscillator 3 as well. So what we can do is we can turn on all of our oscillators here, and then we can set them to different wave shapes, which gives us then a very, very different sound. And as we introduce one, so you can hear that by adjusting the volumes of these oscillators, we can create some quite different sounds. We also here have a noise oscillator. So we can use that then for special effects as well, or to add a little bit of bite to our sounds when we're creating our synth sounds. Moving on from the mixer section, we'll go into the filter. So I'm just going to turn on the one oscillator here. Sorry. So what we're going to do now is play with the filter. Make that a bit brighter with a saw. We have some different filter types here as well that we can use. And then we have an LP1 and LP2. So basically these have different slopes and will create slightly different sounds here. From the cutoff frequency, we have our resonance. And then a contour here as well. Which can be used to adjust the shape of the filter to make it sound slightly different. Moving on then, we have our filter envelope here. Now if we press or control this one here, you can hear that the filter opens gradually over time. We can change how that happens. Let's just make that a little bit different. Then the decay then changes how the filter first of all opens and then begins to close again. Sustain decides on how long the filter will stay open for before the decay starts to operate. So moving on from there, we've got the amp. So this again is very similar to the filter envelope. This controls the volume of the synthesizer or the sound that's coming out. So if I change that, so this is the attack. So this makes it sound very sort of sharp and plucky, whereas this fades in the sound. The decay decides how long the sound stays operating when I release the key on my keyboard. Here you can hear it's very sharp and abrupt ending here. Sustain again decides how long the sound will stay or what at maximum volume for. So let's just make some changes to this. So here we just have a very, very clicky sound. By adjusting this, you can hear that the sound, first of all, abruptly starts, and then it stays at a high volume for a while, and then abruptly ends. But if I add some decay to that, it gives it a little bit of a tail so that it just basically fades away quietly. So that's the basic controls for this type of synthesizer here. And that is more or less how most synthesizers work. But some are much, much more complicated, which gives you a lot more options to create more interesting sounds as well. And that's where we look at then Serum. So if we take a look at Serum here, again, very similar in terms of oscillators. We have 4 oscillators. We have oscillator A, oscillator B, we have a sub-oscillator, and a noise oscillator here. Then from here, we can change our level. So rather than have a dedicated mixer section like this, we have levels on each of these oscillators here so that we can control how loud these sounds are. So if I start with just one of the oscillators, or this one. So here I'm just playing oscillator A. Now I've turned that off, I have no sound at all. Here we have a sub-oscillator. So that can add some weight to our oscillator A or B. Also add some noise. Or we can then mix the 2 oscillators together. So these level knobs are acting very similar to our mixer section here, where we can control the volumes of each oscillator. Next, we're going to move over into the filter section here. And when we're using the filter section on Serum, we have to select the filters, the oscillators that the filter is going to be applied to. So at the moment, we're only applied to oscillator A. I can turn oscillator A off. Yeah. Turn oscillator B on. I can then select just the noise oscillator if I turn the others off. Or the sub oscillator as well. Let's choose something with a bit more brightness. So if we turn all of these on, then that will be applied to all of our oscillators when we have all of these working at the same time. So we have our key track. So basically what this does is as we move up and down the keyboard, this then makes this filter operate depending on which key you press on your keyboard. So that if you want to press a high key, that will then open the filter further up. Press a low key, you see the filter shape is changing when I press keys on the keyboard. So that's another way of controlling or adding interest to your sounds. So let's take a little look now at the different filter types that we have in the Serum. Here we just have 1, 2, 3, 4 filter types. In Serum, we have very many here that we can select. So we'll just have a quick look at some of those. As I'm choosing those, you can see the filter shape is changing depending on what filter I'm using. And these filters have different characteristics so that when we use them, so for example, if I use a high pass filter, or we can maybe move to a band pass. And these sound very different, obviously, to a low pass. Moving back to our oscillators here, we can see that we have some different waveforms on here. And if we just select these, again, lots and lots of different waveforms to choose from for each of the filters A and B. Here is our filter types, our oscillator types that we can select from for the sub oscillator. And then if we go to the noise, again, lots of different options here for noise oscillators as well. So that means we can create then some very interesting sounds that we want to use in our tracks. In order to change the pitch of an oscillator here in Serum, you can click here and move this either up or down, so that then when we play our sounds, you can hear the different pitch of them. And here we can change the finest details of the tuning as well by the semitones, or finer in between them where we have synths. So that's some basic information there about the oscillators and how we use them. We move down here, we have some more complex controls. We have unison. This is where we can thicken our oscillators and spread them apart by detuning them. So that's an interesting tool we can hear there use with that oscillator. Here we've got a wavetable. This is called a wavetable synthesizer, which means that when I move this, just select a different oscillator type here, we can see that the actual oscillator starts to change depending on where this position of this slider is. And if we select, close that. We can go into a 3D view here by clicking on this oscillator. And then as I move that, we can see that the So we can see that the different types of oscillators then are, or that oscillator has very many different options in terms of sounds that we can use with it there. We can move on to this knob here, which is basically giving us some ways of changing the oscillator shapes as well. So here I can select different types of oscillators to modulate this one. So if we use from B, turn on B obviously, just lower its volume. Turn it off. That's not having any effect now. So this is how we can then change the sound of the oscillators to make them much, much more interesting. We can then pan them either left or right, and also then adjust their level. Here is a phase button. This is where when we press the key on our keyboard, the sound will start to play from within the cycle of the oscillator here. So those are the basic controls for the oscillators. Same thing happens with oscillator B. The sub-oscillator here, we change the octave, the pan either left or right, and the level. And then we can press the direct out button, which basically bypasses the filter as well, so that it doesn't get affected by this. But we can also turn it off here as well. And same for the noise oscillators here. So moving on then to our envelopes. What we have here, we have some envelopes in this synthesizer where we can basically change the overall volume and then route these to things like the filter. So let's just have a look at what this one does. So that's our attack, and you can see as I press that, gradually fades in. And then we have a hold section here, a decay, then a sustain, then our release. So here we can shape the sound. Of the sounds that come out of our synthesizer. We can route this by clicking and dragging and dropping onto our filter. So this envelope shape now will affect how that filter works as well. So we can also click and drag within the user interface here, as well as turning these knobs. As I change these settings, you can see how the filter starts to behave differently depending on the shape of our oscillator. We can route LFOs. So if I basically remove the modulation from there, one moment, and then choose this instead. So we can use some basic LFOs as well to change filter parameters. We can link these to any parameter we want on the synthesizer by just clicking and dragging. As well. So moving on from here, then we have our FX section, which this synthesizer doesn't have. And here we can choose lots of different types of effects, and we can also route our LFOs to controls within here as well. To give our sounds a lot more interest as well. And then moving on from here, we have our matrix section. So you can see that we have some LFOs, which we've selected here, LFO1. And this is basically just showing you some more information about where you've been dragging and dropping these modulation sources to, depending on what you want to do with these as well. And it tells you where the destination is and then how it's being applied to each of those controls. So you can see that these synthesizers, okay, one is very basic and very simple, and then one is much more complex, which allows you then to get much more interesting sounds for your tracks. Both are very capable of producing lots of different sounds. I mean, if we go back to Monarch here and have a look at some of the different I'll do the same in Serum. So you can see that the modulation is having an effect on the parameters of this oscillators and making the sounds much more interesting and giving them much more movement. So having a more complex synthesizer enables you to then produce more complex sounds that are much more interesting for your tracks. So hopefully this video has given you some basic tips and tricks about synthesis and how we can use the different controls within synthesizers to make our sounds more interesting. If you like content like this, then please don't forget to like and subscribe, and I can then continue to make more content for you. So thanks for watching, and take care, and see you in the next video.